right. Well, I guess we can go ahead and begin. And then as people trickle in, I'll just keep an eye on the participants, make sure I let everybody in.
Okay, so we're going to all make sure we're on mute. I think everyone is.
Except for Lauren.
Except for Lauren. Okay, and then we are going to listen to Lauren's presentation and then open it for more of discussions and comments and questions after that, I think.
So first of all, thank you. I worked with Angie for years when she lived on Cape Cod, so this is a real treat to get to see Angie, if not in the flesh. And all of you, thanks for spending time on a beautiful day talking about books. I'm going to start with a little presentation that I pretty much created for the students, mostly kids I meet with, but I think it's for all ages, and it's mostly just about my process and about the 3 books for that age group that I have written so far. But I really write for, well, I'll start the presentation, that'll explain itself, and then we'll have some questions after that. So I call this presentation Books for Kids and Everyone Else, as I was about to say, because I don't write for kids, I just write. And when I wrote Wolf Hollow, in fact, I thought it was for adults. My agent said, oh, great, a book for young readers. And I was very surprised by that until I looked at it through her eyes and realized that it did seem suitable for young readers. And in fact, it has fit into that niche well. And then my publisher, of course, wants me to continue to write for that age group, but I really believe my books are, for all ages. They're coming of age stories, but they're about themes that affect all of us, like individuality and standing up against injustice and things like that. So I'm glad to see some adults on my screen today. The 3 Ps, if you're a writer, you may call them other things, but for me, the 3 Ps in this order are what I absolutely need to write. One is place. This is a picture of the ocean off of Newport. That ocean inspired me to write Beyond the Bright Sea. But no matter what I'm writing, I always start with place, and then I add a second P, which is people. This is a picture of my mother and her brothers on the farm that inspired Wolf Hollow. And then the third P is plot, which is, of course, what the characters do, the story they tell me. Setting always comes first. And for me, it is the only way to begin. It's this. This is a picture of the farm where my mother grew up. It's a picture from the 40s. And where I spent a lot of time during my childhood, but as I was growing up as well, I heard my mother's stories from the time I was little. And so being in this place and hearing about what this place was like before I was born all inspired me to write Wolf Hollow. And as far as I'm concerned, if I can create a setting that is in itself a character, then I have at least partially succeeded in what I set out to do. This was the setting for Beyond the Bright Sea. If you've been to the vineyard, Martha's Vineyard, you've been near the Elizabeth Islands, maybe you've been there. This little string of islands here off of Woods Hole ends in one at the end called Cuttyhunk, and a tiny little one off the side here called Pennakees. And so this setting, those 2 islands especially, inspired Beyond the Bright Sea. And then the mountains in Maine, where I go camping, where my mother has some land very far removed from civilization, inspired my new book, Echo Mountain. I write about places where I want to spend time, because writing a novel is a long and solitary exercise, and so I really need to be happy in the place that I'm creating. And that's especially useful to both me and I think to my readers if I can choose settings that are very rich in sensory experiences so that I can connect with you, and hopefully you want to spend time in the world that I've created. So whether it's the farm that inspired Wolf Hollow, or the sea that inspired Beyond the Bright Sea, or things like this swimming hole in Maine that inspired Echo Mountain, if I can recreate these places so that they are rich in sensory experiences, I believe you will connect with them better as well. So that's a real goal of mine. So if I choose a setting I know well, I can dive right in and figure out what else I need to know as I write. The key is to begin, and these are tips I give to kids, but any writers out there of any age, I like what Stephen King says. He's known for writing scary stories, but he says the scariest moment is always just before you start, which is not true for me, because I'll get to that later. I spend a lot of time doing other things before I start so that the beginning is not scary, but I can see how it can be. And Louis L'Amour said, start writing no matter what. The water does not flow until the faucet is turned on. And something kids especially, but all of us need to know is you can always go back and change that beginning. You're not wedded to it. It's just a way to crack things open, to open the door to go through. And then characters come next. I always start with just one, just a glimmer of that character, what her life might be like, maybe a second character who's going to be coming in very quickly in the story. Often inspired by real people in my life. So here's my mother reading to her brothers on the steps of the farmhouse. And I have to say that she, although my character Annabelle is not my mother, she has a lot of my mother in her, and certainly a lot of my mother's life in her life. This little boat on Pennake's Island, pictures like this, and the place itself inspired the character Crow, who I introduced in Beyond the Bright Sea as a newborn baby, strapped into a leaky skiff and pushed out on the tide. But I didn't know what would happen to her after that until I started to write. And then a puppy like this one, or the idea of a puppy like this one, inspired me to create Ellie in Echo Mountain. It's very important to me that I create the most complex, interesting flesh and blood characters I can, because I think that, like setting, characters that are well fleshed out and with whom we can identify are at the heart of any good book. And to do that, I rely on our most universal language. I always ask kids about universal languages, what are they? And they guess things like body language, and they guess things like the senses, but they often don't guess what I think is our most universal language, which is the emotions. So there's my mother in the back row, and my Uncle Harry, and my Uncle Cal, and when people say to me, well, how could you create a character like Toby in Wolf Hollow, who was a soldier, who was wounded in World War I, who came back from that war terribly damaged in every way? How could I create a character like Toby and do a good job of it when I'm not a man, I've never been to war, I don't know what he experienced? And I tell them, I look at my Uncle Cal, the boy here in this oval, who was not that much older than I was, maybe 20 years older. So when I was little, he was a fairly young man, and he was full of life, and he was joyful until he went off to Vietnam. And so when he came back from that war and I saw how changed he was, and I paid attention to that, I was later able to create Toby. So those two universal languages, the senses and the emotions, are my two biggest, most reliable, most powerful tools. The senses, if I can convey to you what a strawberry tastes like, whether you've ever tasted one or not, I will have done my job as a writer. And if I can take you to the drumlins of Cunninghunk and walk along a lane, and I can make you smell the ocean, then I've done my job as a writer. And if I can take you to Maine to the blueberry barrens and show you what those look like without a picture, then I've done my job. And the natural world. I know there are a lot of people on this planet who live in cities, but I believe most of them do have an understanding of the natural world. And so if I use that in my books to make further connections with my readers, then I'm ahead of the game. And then story, which of course is important. These are stories we tell, but for me, story is the least important, or at least it's the last in line. I never, ever know what's going to happen in a book before it happens. I mean, literally, I don't know what's going to happen in the chapter I'm about to start. By the time I'm done the chapter, I'm gobsmacked, as my British friends say. I'm amazed. I'm blown away. I believe, as Doctorow does, that writing a novel is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. And furthermore, this way, I get to have the adventure alongside my characters. I get to be surprised with them. I get to be afraid with them. I get to cry with them and laugh with them. It's a wonderful adventure to write a novel when you don't know where it's going, at least for me. I rely on a combination of fact and fiction. My books are fiction, but they do have very strong strands of fact through them, as most books do, but especially because I write historical fiction. I rely on things that have happened. And forgive my husband for loading the dishwasher, if you can hear him in the background. When I wrote Wolf Hollow, I was it was really interesting to see which memories and which historical facts rose to the surface as I was writing. One of them was when I was a little girl, I went to my grandfather and I asked him how Wolf Hollow got its name. It was this little valley on the edge of the family farm where my mom grew up. And he said, well, when I was a boy, we used to go there and dig ditches and throw in the bones of deer and go away and wait for the wolves to come, which they did, jumped into the ditches to get at the bones and then couldn't get out again. And the next day the farmers would go back to the valley and they would shoot the wolves and turn in their ears for the bounty that the town offers, $3. I think it was $3 for a pair of wolf ears. And so when I was writing this book, inspired by that place, I had my main character go to her grandfather and ask him how Wolf Hollow got its name, and he told her the same story that my grandfather told me. Same thing in Wolf Hollow. There's, if you've read it, you know that there's a contest for the best picture taken at the local department store that month. The winner will get a camera and a lifetime supply of film and processing. This is the picture of my mother and her brothers that actually won that competition like that one, won a camera, won film and processing. And so I have thousands of pictures of that farm in the 40s. Without these two things here, I don't think I would have written the book. And so they made their way into the story, even though it was a work of fiction. I know as librarians, some of you there and people who love libraries, you understand the importance of research, especially for people who write historical fiction as I do. So I do research because everything that I write about has to be historically accurate to a point. But I believe that if I do too much research in advance, the research drives the story instead of the story driving the research. So I begin having done very little, if any, and then I answer my own questions as I go. So I already knew a lot about the ocean when I started writing Beyond the Great Sea. But I learned a lot from research, including some very interesting history that I encountered as I was doing research. I don't know if you know this, but this is an illustration of Captain William Kidd, the pirate. I did not know when I started my research to find out things like what time the ferries ran between Cuttyhunk and New Bedford, or what kind of flowers grew on Cuttyhunk in the 1920s, or what kind of birds nested there. I discovered that this pirate had also frequented the Elizabeth Islands, liked to hide out in the coves there, and according to local legend, I suppose, buried some of his treasure on those islands. It was very hard to forget that. It was very hard to unlearn that bit of history, and it did find its way into my book. But that's one of the very few things that I have encountered in research that affected storyline. For Echo Mountain, my new book, I looked at pictures and read about the Depression in Maine and what it did to people, but mostly I just relied on what I know about the wilderness, because in Echo Mountain I have a girl named Ellie and her family who are forced to leave the town where they've always lived in Maine when the Depression comes, and to move into the mountains to start a new life, to live in the wilderness. And this river hasn't really changed in 100 years, and these woods have not really changed in 100 years. The mountains of Maine are much as they were. So for me, research consisted mostly of camping in weather so cold, I didn't think I was going to survive the night. So I think I know what Ellie felt when she moved into the mountains with her family. But I also read a lot. Ellie, it turns out, has a natural gift as a healer. So I read a lot of books. I did not read these books cover to cover. That red one there that you see on the screen is literally a foot thick. But in order to know what people in the 1920s and 30s knew about medicine, I had to go back to the source. These books are full of things that doctors relied upon and others relied upon in those days in order to treat people who were sick and wounded. I was not allowed to know about things like penicillin because they didn't exist yet. So I read these books. I did a lot of research about bees. If you know about honeybees, you know they are little doctors in their way, and herbs, which are so important for people who practice medicine still around the world. But throughout and always and forever, the most important thing beyond everything else I've just talked about is the writing itself, the right words in the right order as much as I possibly can. I love this quote from Mark Twain: "The difference between the almost right word and the right word is really a large matter. 'Tis the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning." Don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. Anton Chekhov was very good at that. But these are the things I aim for. But also, and this is, I put mostly in here for kids, but I'm sure some of you adults can relate to this as well. A lot of people think that revision is just such a headache and such a maybe necessary evil, but still an evil. And I don't believe that at all, although I used to. It just felt like when I was finished, I wanted to be done with it. I wanted to be done and get published and move on. But I've come to realize, because I do a lot of revising, that it is maybe the most creative part of the process, or at least one of them. And it is very fulfilling. And that even when I think I'm done, and I think I've done my best, if I go back and look at things again, I find that there's a way to improve them. Now, of course, I could go on forever, and no book would ever get published if we always kept going back and back. But there is a stretch before publication where I think authors would be wise to spend as much time as they can revisiting their work. I believe, as Raymond Chandler did, that we should throw up into your typewriter every morning and clean up every noon. I was going to say computer, but it works the same way. This one I put in for the kids because they know we're all dull, and I know you do too. By the time I am nearing the end of a story, the first part will have been reread and altered and corrected at least 150 times. Good writing is essentially rewriting. I am positive of this. I am also positive of this. I believe, with few exceptions, that going back and reworking material is always to the good. And again, for the kids, I put in Neil Gaiman. The best advice I can give on this is, once it's done, to put it away until you can read it with new eyes. Finish the short story, print it out, put it in a drawer, and write other things. When you're ready, pick it up and read it as if you've never read it before. If there are things you aren't satisfied with as a reader, go in and fix them as a writer. That's revision. And I believe that's true, that every writer is 50% reader, that we have to have some distance from our work to be able to see it clear-eyed, otherwise, and with a little bit of objectivity at least. Otherwise, we can't see what it needs. And so, of course, we rely on our other readers as well. So my advice is just think about what you know, what you care about, what you want to share. Don't spend a lot of time obsessing about how to begin. Just do it. Trust your characters enough to follow where they lead. Although if you're one of those authors that likes to map everything out right to the last word, if that's what works for you, go for it. Try to use fresh language, full of the senses, emotions, and other things we have in common. Revise, revise, revise. Read as much as you can. Write as much as you can. Believe in yourself and your story. So to the writers out there, there's my advice, but it's also how I write. So since we're here to talk about these books, I figured I would let you know that. I would love, before we have questions, to just read the very first part of Echo Mountain, since I assume, well, I shouldn't assume. Your questions are probably going to be mostly about other things because this is so new. But if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to introduce you to Ellie. So as I said, she and her family have moved to the mountains of Maine during the Depression, and she has taken to this new life. She and her father and her little brother Samuel have taken to the wilderness, and Ellie especially sees in it not only a fresh start, but a new way to discover who she is and to make herself useful and to prove to herself and others how resourceful and brave and capable she is. But her mother and her older sister are not at all happy in the wilderness. They long for the town they've left, and so there's some friction between them. This is how it starts. The first person I saved was a dog. My mother thought he was dead, but he was too young to die. Just born, still wet and glossy. Beautiful, really, but not breathing. Take him away, she said, sliding him into my cupped hands. Her voice was cold. Perhaps that was why it shook a little. But I knew her better than that. Maisie curved around her 3 living pups as they poked blindly toward her milk, watched me with aching eyes. I could feel how much she hurt, too. What should I do with him, I asked. Bury him far beyond the well. My mother turned to tidy the bedding straw. It was as red as Christmas. We'd all had a hard night, but it had been hardest for the last of the pups. the one in my hands. I cradled him close against my chest, as if I had two hearts, but only one of them beating, then carried him away from the woodshed into the pale spill of morning light, past the cabin, toward the well, and a grave waiting beyond it. But then I stopped, looked back, and there on the cabin's broad granite step, a wooden pail brimming with cold water, waiting to be useful. I didn't know what was about to happen, but a little flicker in my chest flamed at the sight of that water, full of green and blue from the tree, the sky overhead. Calm, simple. It spoke to me with a voice louder than my mother's as she stood at the door of the woodshed, bloody straw bundled in her arms, and said, "Go on then, Ellie." But I didn't go on then. The flicker, the flame, the voice all tugged me toward the bucket, where I plunged the baby dog deep into the cold, cold water and held him there until I felt him suddenly lurch and struggle. "Ellie, what are you doing?" my mother said, dropping the straw and rushing toward me. But she stopped and stared when I lifted the dripping, squirming pup and pulled him back against my chest. "He's not dead," I said, smiling, "not dead at all," which made my mother smile too for just a moment. "Then he's yours," she said, turning back to the straw. "See that you keep him that way." I didn't know if she meant that I should keep him alive or keep him mine, but I intended to do both. So that's the beginning of Echo Mountain, and I can talk more about that book since that's sort of the focus of this, but I'd really rather answer questions, and I'm sure anything I would have said will come through in my answers. So does anyone have a question? No questions at all? Angie? Anna.
Hi. I'm just curious about some of your other inspirations for just writing in general. Like, were there any particular authors that inspired you or anything that made you a writer?
I'm always inspired by things I've read. I try very hard not to replicate, borrow, steal, echo. But, you know, it's impossible because everything you read goes into your bones and comes out in other ways. But I try really hard not to go in a different direction. But I have been very inspired. Well, one of my favorite books, and perhaps the greatest inspiration I have, is Goodnight Moon, which for me will always probably be the flame that lit the wick in me. I go back to that great green room frequently and just love everything about it. The cadence, the word choice, the illustrations, of course, but even without them, it's a song that I replay in my head a lot. And many books along the way. I love Charlotte's Web. I love Island of the Blue Dolphins. I loved a lot of historical fiction. But I also love fantasy, and I love futuristic stuff. I mean, I just love a little of everything. As an adult, I have a pretty broad diet, if you want to put it that way. I like a little fudge, which for me is good mysteries, good, you know, crime thrillers. Love those for escapism. I truly, though, my meat and potatoes are books like All the Light We Cannot See. Don't know if you've read that. Serious, dark books. They're hard. I just read one that's new, Taya Obret, and I think I'm pronouncing her last name properly. It's called, oh God, it's called Inland. She wrote The Tiger's Wife a few years ago. She's like 30 years old. I want to kill her. Her writing is so beautiful, so gorgeous, and such an inspiration to me. And in fact, if I ever doubt writing for kids, it's when I read a book like that, because she does things in that I could never do in a book for children, because it's really hard. It's hard work to read her. But it's amazing the places where she took me, the language she used and what it did to my heart. I mean, just that it shook me to my core, that book. And I want to go, all right, you know, I'm just going to do that now. I'm going to start clean. I'm just going to write the book of my life without regard to anything. But that's not, you know, I could have done that when I was 30, right? I could have done that before I started writing for young people. So I think that's just not me, but it is what I love to read. And other things, Anna, that inspired me, everyone I've ever met, every day I've ever lived, every place I've ever been, you know, it all goes into the well, and then it all comes back up again in some way or other. But the natural world, yeah, keep finding more and more that the natural world is my true inspiration. Mary?
Have you always written? Like, did you always know that you wanted to be an author, or did you want to do
Yes.
something else?
I have always written. My mother tells stories about how when I was really little, before I knew how to write, that I would talk in poetic language. I mean, I'm not sure she's right about that. You know how mothers can be, but this when kids ask questions like this, my answer is always twofold. That, you know, some things I believe you're born with. That there are seeds in all of us, and some of them get watered, and some of them don't. Some of them find fertile ground, and some of them don't. Some of them we ignore to our peril. Some of them we develop. And so I do think we're born with certain things. But then when people encourage us, when people tell us we're good at something, we do more of it. And the more we do of it, the better we get at it, and the more compliments we get. So the more we do it, and the better we get at it, and the more we, you know, and it's this thing that sometimes I really think that the seeds, that things wither on the vine when they're not watered, and that people can start off with gifts that just don't get developed because either they themselves don't encourage themselves to continue to work hard at things, or they're discouraged by others, or life gets in the way, I don't know, or they just find something else that they love, so they play basketball and they never knew they could have played the violin. I don't know, but I have always written, and I've always felt good doing it, and to be honest, I've always been encouraged, and so it's like a trifecta, and I don't know who I am when I'm not writing. I don't feel whole, so even if I weren't being published, I would be writing. I think there was a chat question. I saw it pop up. Why children? Am I still a child? Well, yes, of course I am, Amy. That's a good question, though. It's a little coincidental, sort of like the answer to my last question. I wrote Wolf Hollow as a tribute to my mother and the farm where she grew up, and that lifestyle, and what I remembered of the farm, how happy I was there, that way of life, all of it, the natural world. And it was a big hit, and I got a lot of love for it, and I got a 2-book deal, and then I got another 2-book deal to write books for kids. But I really like kids too, and I liked being a kid. If I could go back to an age in my life, it wouldn't be my 20s. It would probably be 12 or 13, because you're halfway across the bridge between childhood and adulthood, and there's just everything is possible. And at least it was for me and people who are lucky like I was. And so I just like writing about kids. I think they're a really incredibly smart, wise, promising age group. So
I see your sense of play in your artwork, so I think it goes hand in hand. You're a total child in my book.
That's true. I do it. Yeah, whimsy. I'm very fond of whimsy. And so, yeah, thanks, Amy. I take that as a compliment.
It is.
Thanks. Anybody else have a question?
Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I guess I've heard other authors talk about following the characters and not knowing what story is going to unfold, but it's so hard for me to believe. I guess I'm just more of like a puzzle maker or a logical thinker, that I think I would have a lot of sticky notes all over my writing studio and arrows and connections.
Sure.
Do your characters ever bring you down a path that is like not fruitful and then you have to back up?
I don't usually have to back up, but I sometimes have to take a break because I'm not sure where we're going, and I'm not sure there is anywhere to go to. And the worst thing you can do when you have writer's block or a problem is sit and stare at a screen or a piece of paper. So I go off and I make a piece of art, or I cook something, or I go into the garden, or I take a shower, and I think I have no idea what's going to happen in this book. And then I go back and sit down, and the character's like, where have you been? Let's go. And there's a place to go. But now I don't want to, no spoilers here. Have you read Wolf Hollow?
Yes.
All of you? It's okay to say you haven't. You haven't? Okay. All right, then I won't give any spoilers, but there's one chapter where something rather awful happens. And I didn't know, honest to Pete, I started writing the chapter, and by the time I finished, I couldn't believe that this had happened. And it had such a strong bearing on the rest of the story that it freaked me out a little. I thought, wait a minute, what if that hadn't happened? What if, for whatever reason, that isn't what had come to me as I was writing? The story would have potentially gone in a completely different direction. But that's the beauty of it. You know, when my husband and I go exploring, what I call exploring, he has an agenda, a map. He knows where we're going, where we're going to end up, what time we should get there. And I'm like, oh, that looks like a good road. Let's go that way. And he's like, nope, that's not in the plan. He's a type A, you know, concrete sequential. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't know what the opposite of concrete sequential is anymore, but I did write a book once where I had a roadmap. And it was inspired when I was cleaning out this little barn behind my mother's house where I had stored all my stuff from college, boxes of papers, right? Journals, all this crap. She said, it's time. It's been like 15 years. Get it out of here. And I discovered that a mouse had made a nest in one of the boxes and had chewed through half of a journal. So I could only get parts of my story. And I thought, wow, maybe this is a book. Maybe this is the basis for a book. And here's what would happen. And I mapped it all out. And I wrote the whole thing, a whole novel. And it felt like work the whole time I was writing it because I knew what was supposed to happen next. And when I finished it, I read it and I was like, this is tedious business. And everyone else thought so too. It will never be published. It's waiting for me to have the courage to burn it, which I will do someday when we need kindling. Because it's just not, the writing's okay. It's flat. So, Nancy, I think writers should do whatever works for them. But for me, I really mean it when I say, well, I should back up and I should tell you, I'm a very fast writer, so Wolf Hollow took 3 months. Beyond the Bright Sea took about 3 months. Echo Mountain took a while longer because I have a job and I was really busy. But I do spend weeks before I put down a single word in my head in that place, watching as the character appears. And I watch her just doing her you know, walking around, eating. I just spend time with her till I get to know her really, really well. And then I write in the first person, so I'm just slipping right into her skin and seeing the world through her eyes. So I know her intimately. And so I trust her to know what she's doing. And then I follow. But I have to admit that when I go back to revise, I often see patterns and threads that I didn't really notice when I was writing, and I go back and develop those. So it's not like I write start to finish with no map and I'm done, off it goes to the printer. There's a lot of fixing up later. Anybody else have a question or a comment?
I have a question. I have a lot of questions.
Okay, Mary was just going to ask one, and then we'll
Go for it.
So if it takes you 3 months, how long does it take you to revise then? Like, how long is your whole process?
It depends, partly because my editor she calls herself the glacier. She's so slow. So like I just today sent her my new book. I finished a new book,
Wow.
just the revision of it. But the process was that it took me, I don't know, a few months to write it. And then I put it away for 2 weeks. And then I got it out and I read through it and I thought about it. And I let 4 or 5 people read it and I listened to what they had to say. Then I let it sit for a little while longer. Then I came back and I started revising it. And I revised it. Then I sent it to my agent and she read it and said, I think there are too many characters, which some other readers had said, and which my gut was telling me was the truth. So I took out 3 characters, and that required serious revision to make it all work. And then after that, I let it sit for a week, and then I read it through, and I tweaked it, and then this morning I sent it to my editor. She will take 6 months before she sends me her notes on it. Her notes will be indecipherable. I mean, I wish I could read them to you. She is very smart and very good, but it takes me weeks to figure out what she's trying to say to me. I once made the mistake of asking if she could just do it in bullet form, and she got very angry. I don't do bullet form. So once I figure out what she's trying to tell me, then I make the changes that I agree with. And then we do the line editing, the copy editing, line editing down to the fine details. It's a very long process. And there are big waiting periods during that. So let's see, I finished, well, I guess Wolf Hollow took a year and a half or two to go from the pen to the page, to the published page. That's pretty quick, actually, for
For a book.
yeah. Angie?
Yeah. So between the 3 middle grade books that you've written, Wolf Hollow, Beyond the Bright Sea, and Echo Mountain, do you have a favorite book that you just absolutely loved writing?
That is the question I get more than any other question, I think. And I always say it's like asking which of my children I like the best. By the way, I write about girls, I think, because I have sons. This is where I get to have daughters. The answer to that question is I love them all, but because Wolf Hollow, well, for a couple of reasons. I wrote Wolf Hollow after a long dry spell where I didn't get anything published. I had a book published for adults when I was in my 30s. Then I wrote a book that was far superior that didn't get published, largely because I lost my editor. He retired and then he died. And unless you have a best-selling book, unless you have a really strong connection with the publisher, if your editor leaves, that's it. You got to start all over again, which I didn't know was a crushing blow to me. So because my first book did well critically but didn't do well financially, I had to start all over again. And though I had what I thought was a better book in hand, I had no editor. I had no agent. So I had a long dry spell there. When I wrote Wolf Hollow, it was because I just decided, screw that. I'm just not going to worry about all that nonsense anymore. Of course I care because writers rely on publishers to reach their readers. But I just decided I was going to write a tribute to my mom and her farm. And that was it. And that was the only reason I was going to write it. I was going to write it from the heart. I was going to write it because I care about that story, her story and the fictional story. And when I finished it, I felt like I had done something good and true and important to me, even if it wasn't important to anyone else. And of course, then the irony is that I found an agent immediately. Within 5 days, she had 7 offers from publishers. So as soon as I stopped caring about getting published, my career took off. So for those reasons, Wolf Hollow, I think, will always be my favorite. It's my strongest connection with the things I care most deeply about.
Awesome. And sort of on the subject of what you were just talking about, you write a lot from a woman or a girl's perspective. Do you think you'll give it a shot at writing from a male perspective?
That's an interesting question. When I wrote Beyond the Bright Sea, I may have told you this story, Angie, but I shared the first 20 pages of it with my writers group. I wrote maybe 30 pages and I shared the first 20, and somebody said, well, is the main character a boy or a girl? And I realized I hadn't used a pronoun yet because it's first person, and that, could happen. And I said, wow, really? You don't know? And they said, no, you haven't told us yet. So I wrote the whole book without any pronouns. I wanted to do an experiment. I just wrote it from this kid's perspective. I was writing from, I thought the character was probably maybe a boy. The name was Crow. So, Crow is, so I gave it to 8 people to read. Half of them thought Crow was a boy. Half of them thought Crow was a girl. And they were all completely shocked when I told them that I had not told them, which was in my head. They said, of course you did. Of course you used he or she. And I said, no, I didn't. I never did. They went back and looked, and I never did, not once. And some people were very angry about that. My mother-in-law was very angry. She was like, this is a boy, damn it. There's no way this is a girl. But one little girl, one 12-year-old girl who was sitting across the table from me when I told her that I hadn't used any pronouns, she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I didn't. You're the one who decided Crow was a girl." She was so completely overwhelmed with joy at the idea that it had been up to her. She thought it was the coolest thing ever. But I really had intended Crow to be a boy. So I sent it to my editor. She said, "You can't do this." I don't even think she noticed the floating gender, but she said, "If this were a book about gender identity, you could do it, but it's not. It'll be perceived as gimmicky. It'll be a distraction. And furthermore, the very first review that's written about it will reveal the secret. So nobody will be able to read it if they've heard, about this without that distraction. And so you can't do it. And it's up to you if Crow is a boy or a girl, but she's a girl. You have to make her a girl." And I said, "Why do I have to make her a girl?" She said, "We need more stories out here about strong, smart, brave girls. That's it." And, I could have fought the fight, but as far as I was concerned, it could go either way. So all I had to do was go in and tweak it a little bit to make her, add some pronouns first of all. But as far as, Angie, to answer your question more directly about writing about boys, I am working on an idea right now, and I just started to play with it, about doing an alternating chapter book. Boy, girl. So it's really two main characters of equal importance. I don't know if it'll take or not, but I'm kind of spending time in my head with it.
Awesome. And there is a message in the chat from Amy.
Okay.
She said, "You are a very busy person. Your artwork, your books, the cultural center, and who knows what else. So are you constantly doing something?"
Yes. but sometimes it's watching TV. I love
I don't believe
doing
it.
television. I'm sorry about my husband unloading the dishwasher. Honest to Pete, I don't know how many times I have begged him not to do this. Can you hear that? It's like a construction zone on the other side of the door.
Don't worry
fine.
about it.
Oh, Amy, right. Yeah, I tend to, I don't like to be idle. I have a real problem with being idle. So I have trained myself to just sit and think, but even that is an active process. If I want downtime, I usually watch TV because it turns my brain off.
Mhm.
And but no, I like to be very busy. I like lots of projects. So yes, the full-time job gets to be a little much. Right now, working at home and Zooming all day, trying to raise money for a nonprofit is terrible. I have to say, it's absolutely demoralizing, but it's worthy. Good work.
Who would have thunk? I also wrote that your revisions sound like your constructions, a true puzzle, that you just really, the way you're putting things together and you make things happen, and you make those connections. So that was kind of an afterthought. When you
no, Amy, that's a good question and a good comment. It's true that when I make art, it's usually a matter of I do assemblage art, so I'm putting things together in new ways, and the pieces kind of tell me where they belong. I have a lot of faith in the materials that I use.
It's so interesting, just the visual versus the verbal. I mean, sometimes you don't have both, and yet you kind of work seamlessly with both.
I try to. They do kind of complement each other. Working in my workshop is the best thing for when I have writer's block. The power drill is a great thing. It's very therapeutic. A power saw is even better, but very noisy. So when I'm working with tools, working with my hands, the brain is still doing its thing in the background, and it's a great way to solve writer's block.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Nancy?
Can you tell us about your next book, or is that a deep secret right now?
My editor told me not to talk about it only because if the salespeople at Penguin hear about it, they're going to go nuts. It's another Wolf Hollow book. So I don't know if I want to call it a sequel. It is, I suppose. It takes place just a few months after the end of Wolf Hollow, and it has many of the same characters, but it's a very different story. very different. And I really enjoyed writing it, but so I forget who asked me, I think it was you, Nancy, do I get up to a place where I just don't know what's going to happen next? Yeah, that happened a lot in this one. I was very distracted by the fact that it followed another book, and I had to continually be thinking about what my readers were, how much I needed to tell them about what had come before. I didn't really like that process very much, and it was distracting, and it threw me for a loop a few times. But it's done now, and I'm just going to wait my 6 months until I hear if my editor's okay with it.
Was it your idea to write sort of a sequel to Wolf Hollow, or was that the publisher coming up with that?
No, no. In fact, she discouraged me, but I was already 100 pages in when I told her, so she said, all right, finish it. But, well, what she said was, it depends. Like, if you're writing a series of books, some series are great, and people eat them up, and they wait for the next one with bated breath. The way she put it was, she said, Wolf Hollow is a book that is entire unto itself. It is a piece of whole cloth. It doesn't, if you've written a sequel, it better be worthy, and also it better be able to stand on its own. And that freaked me out a little bit too. I wish I hadn't asked her or told her about this, but we were at a conference in Baltimore and I blurted it out. But then that was in my mind the whole time. And the more you're thinking about what comes later, the less able you are to focus on what needs to be done, which is just writing. So we'll see. If she doesn't like it, I'm going to be pretty bummed because, I like it. I think she will. And my agent is a very honest woman, and she read it first and told me she thought it was a go. So we'll find out. Mary?
Do you always have an audience in mind? So like or culturally, like what's going on right now? Are you like, how can I deal with the endemic that we're in, or the virus going on? Does that trigger any kind of thinking of how you're going to write, or are you unto your own? Like,
I think I'm going to be unto my own. It's interesting how many people are finding parallels between Echo Mountain, which is kind of a survival book, in the wilderness, and what's going on now. Of course, I didn't intend that. I didn't know this was coming. And there's nothing new under the sun. Everything we experience is an echo of some kind. But no, I don't think so. I don't think it will affect how I write or what I write, but it will affect how I deal with people like you after the process. I was slated to go on a month-long tour across the country starting on April 19th. Well, yeah, that got canceled. And at first I was very disappointed because I love meeting with people, and I had all these wonderful events lined up, and it's fun. You get to go to wonderful places and do cool things. But I've been Zooming a lot with groups across the country, and I have a feeling that that's the way literary tours are going to go for the most part. There will still be conferences, I hope, in person, and all kinds of big events, but I think to be more accessible is important, and there are a lot of schools out there that don't get author visits very much, and I think that's important. I used to do author visits for free because I was like, well, the schools can't afford me. They can't afford to pay for authors to come. And then a friend of mine who writes, I'm sure you know of her, but I won't mention her name in case you don't like what she said. But she said, no, you have to charge, and you have to charge as much as possible for a couple of reasons. One, you're a professional person. You deserve to be paid just like the plumber and the electrician and everybody else who contributes in a school. And second of all, if you don't charge, they don't treat you as well. And it's true. As soon as I started charging, they treated me like royalty. And when I upped my price, they treated me even better, which is bizarre. But I did it because it's a lot of work to go on school visits. It's it's really exhausting. So I followed her advice, and a lot of other people said the same thing as well. But I really felt terrible that these little public schools in the Bronx and all over the country, they're not getting the kind of attention they deserve. So a couple of days ago, I met with some kids in the Bronx over Zoom, and
cool.
I think that's a really good way to level the playing field, and I hope we all do more of it.
That's awesome. I have another question if nobody else. Okay. So you talked a lot about how you incorporate people that you know in your life into your characters. Have you ever written yourself into a character, even just pieces of yourself?
Yes, pieces of myself for sure. So Ellie in Echo Mountain, who turns out to be a healer, is a lot like me. I don't know why. If I weren't a writer, I might be a doctor or possibly a detective, because I love to find things that are lost. I mean, somebody says, "Oh, I can't find my wallet." I go like into bloodhound mode. It's like I don't know what comes over me, but I love to find things that are lost. I love to solve mysteries and solve puzzles, and I love to heal people. So I kind of put those aspects of myself into Ellie because she's trying to, because you're reading it now, and Nancy, you finished it. She's trying to figure out what's wrong, to fix one problem. She's trying to heal people. She's just totally in Lauren mode for quite a bit of the book. She's also very empathetic, and I at least try to be empathetic. And yes, there are elements of me in all my protagonists, but probably Ellie is the closest to me of the three so far. We have a few minutes left. Final questions? No? Can I ask you guys a couple? Oh, sorry, Liz, you have a question? Unmute yourself.
I got it. I just wondered, when you've given your work to friends to read or to your editor, have you ever had them comment in some way which you just really disagreed with? Like you thought, no, you got it all wrong and I don't want to change it? Or do you just say, oh, okay, I'll change it?
That's a good question. So the floating gender thing, that really disappointed me, but I knew she was right. And that's why you have a good editor, because she knows these things. In Wolf Hollow, I had a character in the book who had Down syndrome, and that was a reflection of my mother's life. She had an aunt named Olive who lived in the family with them 3 generations, aunts, uncles, cousins. It was, post-depression. They all lived together, very poor. And they had this woman who had Down syndrome, and they all took care of her together. And she was just such a part of the family, and there was never any question about her living with them. And I thought it was just a lovely commentary on that family and that time and that place. And my editor read the book and said, she has got to go. And I said, why? A couple of reasons. One, unfortunately, in publishing, as in many fields, there's a lot of awareness about what's politically correct and what's safe. So I don't really have any experience writing about people with disabilities or knowing about in my personal life anyone with Down syndrome. She said, the gatekeepers are going to be all over this. The gatekeepers are going to smack you around for doing this. And I said, well, so what? Like, come on. She said, yeah, but the more important point is she doesn't add anything of value really to the book, and she's a distraction. And you really need to remove her. And I said, well, I don't accept the first reason, but I will look at the second reason. And I looked at it and I thought, okay, I'm just going to see what it would be like to remove her. It took me 10 minutes because she wasn't integrated in the book. She just appeared here and appeared there, and I could pluck her out and add a couple of words. And honestly, she was gone in 10 minutes, and that proved that my editor was right. If she'd really belonged in that book, she would have really belonged in that book. And so I took her out. There's a scene in Wolf Hollow where Toby is in the hayloft. A couple scenes where Toby, a grown man, is in the hayloft with a little girl, and they're friends. And I got a little, the Newbery Committee isn't going to like this. And I said, well, then I won't win the Newbery. Because I'm sorry, there is nothing wrong with their relationship. And looking at it that way is just wrong. And I will not change it. And they said, okay. And then I won a Newbery medal, the honor. So, I think they're just hyper sensitive. But in general, I trust my editor a lot. She's never asked me to do anything that I felt so strongly about that I was willing to absolutely say no. I have pushed back, and she said, well, in the end, it's your book, but I strongly urge you to consider it. And in the end, I've considered it, and I've decided she was right. So I'm hoping we don't ever get to the point where I have to really dig in my heels, because she's known as the Glacier, but she's also known as the Dragon Lady of publishing, because she's really, really fierce. So yeah, I'm a chicken. We've got 2 minutes left, and I'm not worried about my time, but I'm worried about yours. But if anybody has one last question, we have time for that. Nope. It's been really nice talking to all of you, spending an hour with you on a beautiful day, and I hope we get to meet face to face in Dover or somewhere as time goes by, and I hope you all stay well, and this all ends soon. Angie, thank you so much. Nancy, thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me today. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Lauren. It was so good to see you again.
Thank
Like,
you.
it's been a couple of
Come
years
see me on
now.
the Cape. Yeah, when we can. Come see me on the Cape.
Let me know when you reopen and I'll come visit.
I will.
With my
I will.
mask.
I will. Thank you all so much.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Lauren.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.